institutions. What kind of higher education institutions do these rankings depict, or what kind of picture of higher education emerges? I would like to focus next few minutes on that. Firstly, as we can go back to this slide on the rankings of the QS. So now we discussed what do various rankings consider. Now is the point to arrive at some conclusions based on these considerations. What is it that these rankings benchmark in terms of quality? What is expected of higher education institutions? Globally, there is concern in the industry, in the market, that the students who graduate out of higher education institutions are not employable. That is becoming a major concern in the market, in the industry, and therefore affecting nations, countries. How do these rankings help? These rankings set benchmarks in terms of how higher education institutions function in the marketplace, whereby the graduates coming from these higher education institutions, they gain good employment, they are considered employable by the employers or the industry or the market, and thus has become a very important benchmark. What is also happening is globally the funding from the government, higher education institutions, as we discussed earlier, the quality institutions emerged in a backdrop where the government was the main funder of higher education. That situation is now changing. Now in this changing scenario, the institutions have to compete for funding, and this funding may come from various sources. It may come from the government, again related to the conditionality of the quality of the higher education institution or the assessment of the higher education institution. Other could be the industry based funding, which is highly competitive, and the other third as a funding source could be the students. So these higher education institutions globally, they compete for good students, not only good students who have good achievement marks in their previous examinations, but also the students who are able to fund their education. So therefore, because of this competition in amongst the higher education institutions, if they are able to project themselves at good institutions, they are able to attract good faculty, good students, and therefore project themselves at good higher education institutions. All these aspects, according to the viewpoint of the stakeholders, are actually debatable. India, for example, had this concern for long that the Indian institutions do not figure in the world university rankings. Of course, we have some of our institutions, very good institutions, which figure in a top 500, but at the time of the discussion when it happened, the debates which were happening in 2011-12, the concerns were that the institutions do not figure in the world universities top 200 rankings. Considering the issue of quality and the concerns with the quality at the national level, the Indian government launched the MHRD through the MHRD, the Ministry of Human Resources and Development Initiative, in 2015, the National Institutional Ranking Framework. And the first edition of these rankings was released in 2016. Two committees were developed or constituted. One committee looked at the technical higher education institutions and developed a framework for the institutional ranking for the technical institutions, and then yet there was another committee which looked at the multidisciplinarity of the institutions, and therefore according to that aspect in mind prepared a framework for the multidisciplinary institutions, the universities and colleges. Based on these two, there was then a committee, the National Level Review Committee was constituted, which looked at both the frameworks, tweaked them, made some suggestions, and then based on the suggestions of the National Review Committee, NLRC, final rankings or the changed rankings, a new version of rankings was proposed with slightly changed parameters in 2017. Initially, the rankings have been confined to higher education institutions of very reasonable size, but also these centrally funded higher education institutions. And when it comes to centrally funded higher education institutions, it is irrespective of their size. The parameters which are considered in the NIRF are the following 5. You can see that on the screen: the teaching, learning and resources, research and professional practice, graduate outcomes, outreach and inclusivity, and perception. Very important, if there is an analysis in one of the books edited, the India Higher Education Report 2017 by the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, where there is a chapter on the National Institutional Ranking Framework by Professor Furkan Kapar, and this chapter looks at, analyzes the rankings. What we see from this, based on the analysis of the 2017 rankings, then the institutions which, if we consider the first 100 institutions, the institutions which is at the top most, the first, and the institution which is at the 100th position, there is a huge gap in terms of the teaching, learning and resources, research and professional practice, graduate outcome, outreach and inclusivity, and perception. So even in the terms of the overall score, even the topmost institution has not been able to achieve 100. It remains closer to 83, 84, and the institution which is at the 100th position has achieved something around some score around 35 or so. So this is the huge quality gap, we can say, in terms of the overall score. And of course, if you look at the parameter wise also, there are gaps in the scores of the institutions which are ranked top and institution in the 100th position in the country. Now, why should we worried about it, and why should it be concerned when we are talking about the quality? One thing is that it is not only about gaining a position in the league tables that we should be concerned about quality. After all, if we claim that our institution, our curriculum is a quality curriculum, what we teach is quality teaching, then the larger audience want to understand how can we show that this is quality. Institutions want to know it, teachers want to know it, based on their, how their learners are learning, and the regulators want to know it, that what they are spending on, what they are funding is delivering what it is supposed to do. And therefore, these considerations becomes, without being competing for resources, without that necessity even, it is important to consider these aspects in the quality and understanding the quality of higher education in the higher education institutions. And therefore, what has happened is that globally there has been a surge in quality assurance initiatives. It started in 80s, but that was also a period when the private sector also started expanding, and across, if we look at the level of institutions, at the level of systems, policies and schemes, we find that this surge is there globally because of the expanding and diverse system. Higher education institutions are no longer those institutions which have this ivory tower image, where only few considered elites are able to gain entry. So there is a demand from the people, from the public, for the expansion of the higher education system. Not only these institutions or the higher education systems are expanding, they are becoming diverse. So initially, if these were small private initiatives, then they converted, or there were large state supported initiatives, and then again private sector has entered into. So initially, if there were small private initiatives, then there were government supported initiatives, and now the trend is that the private sector is expanding. So higher education institutions are more in number in the private sector than in the public supported institutions. There are also pressures of globalizations where the institutions are competing not only for knowledge for students but also for funding amongst each other. Institutions want to compare themselves with institutions in some other parts of the world. There is also, as we mentioned in the issue of the expansion and diversification of the system, that there is the relationship between higher education and the state is also changing. So earlier the state was the regulator as well as funder, but now the funding aspect is declining. The state is more of a regulator to assure the quality through its various allied arms, but also it's not that much a funder. And therefore, there is a diversity of institutional arrangements. We also see that with the expansion of this higher education, there is also diversity in the modes of delivery in which the higher education is becoming available for the students of higher education, of entering the higher education. One example is that it's from the earlier it was formal, regular, and then there came a phase where open and distance learning entered the higher education system with the emergence of new technologies, and this course itself is one example where we are interacting with each other in a video mode, that with the emergence of new technology, open and blended learning, video based learning systems are becoming very important ways in which higher education is becoming available to the students. Marketisation and privatisation, it's a continuing theme since 1980s, that if the institutions have to compete for funding, and we discussed this when we talked about the rankings of the higher education institutions, that higher education institutions now have to compete with each other for the funding. That may not be the case if you are working as a teacher in an institution which is funded by the government. Decreasing public financial resources are affecting the higher education institutions. People want to know where the money is going. Wherever the money is put in by the government, whether it is producing good results or not. So there are concerns. In India, you may look around in your region, in your state, there have been concerns with the higher education. There is increasing demand for better public services, and which is also derived from the new public management approach in education sector, not only in education sector but across the industry, and internationalization. These are some of the key drivers for this surge. Different countries have responded to these drivers differently, and they arranged the quality assurance in their systems accordingly. So one interaction point I think I would suggest is that you look at your institution where you are working, where the region in which is located, the state in which it is located, and just think of the concerns of quality higher education in your state, in your region, in your institution. And also, if these are the concerns, whatever concerns you arrive at, and you think these are the concerns, then how the higher education quality assurance is organized to address these quality concerns. Is it doing enough at the federal level, which is at the central level or the government level, or at the institutional level? So what it should be doing, just have some thoughts on it. We'll move to the next section now.